Before we start, does anyone remember who we're discussing out of chapter 15? What was that? Moab? That's right. Just seeing if we've paid attention. So we're talking about Moab. We're talking about another nation that's being prophesied of them facing a judgment. And if you remember, chapter 15 and verses 2 through 5, we had at least 8 cities within Moab being mentioned. And basically this was painting the picture of a total destruction on this nation. And we discussed how this nation was guilty of pride and arrogance, and they also had idolatry, images that they've made that they want to worship. So similar things they're guilty of that all the other heathen nations were also guilty of. And we touched on verse 5 in chapter 15, and we discussed how verse 5 says, "My heart shall cry out to Moab, for Moab." And we discussed how God, even though this was a heathen nation, God still had that love for the people, that He desired their souls to be in the right place. He desired them to be followers of Him. And they had every opportunity, just like Judah and just like Israel, they had every opportunity to follow God, but they chose not to, just like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and so on and so on. So we connected that verse with some verses in 2 Peter to where God desires all men to be saved. And that shows that God is the same God today that He was back then. He's always had a desire for everybody to be a follower of Him. So here we are, we're moving into chapter 16, and we're going to continue with the same thought of Moab facing a destruction if they do not correct or repent from their actions. And we're going to see as we get into chapter 16 that Moab chooses not to follow God and to continue in their prideful ways. So I will admit that this chapter and some of the verses, the way it's worded, really gave me some difficulty as to understanding what we're talking about here. And maybe you guys don't have those issues, but it's something I deal with. If something's not worded pretty clear for me, I get really bogged down, and I have to do a lot of thinking and reading and trying to make the connections to understand what it's even talking about. So we'll start here in chapter 16 and the first 5 verses. It says, "Send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah, to the wilderness unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. Take counsel, execute judgment. Make thy shadows as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth. Let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness." So when you guys read this, and when you get down in the verses 4 and 5, you know, it's a little hard to understand what we're talking about here. So why don't we this morning, we're going to start with verse 1. We're going to break it down. And then when we get down into verse 4 and 5, I'm going to present some things to you guys. And I'm going to present maybe a couple avenues that we can look at on those verses. Ultimately, the outcome of both avenues still gets you to the same place. So we'll go over that here in a little bit. But just to break down the verses here. So in the first verse, it says, "Send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah to the wilderness unto the mount of the daughter of Zion." I looked and looked and looked for a good map, and I can't find any. And this is the best that I had to offer. So before I get into discussing what we're talking about here, so send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land. So we discussed a little bit last week about some past history of Moab dealing with Israel. Does anyone know of a reference or an instance in past history here of the people to where a lamb to the ruler of the land would have happened? And when we're talking about send ye a lamb to the ruler of the land, we're basically talking about maybe a tribute offering. Anyone? That's right. You know the verse off the top of your head? That's right. 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 4. We can turn there unless Penny's already turned there. Okay, let's turn there then. So if we remember, we had an instance here in 2 Kings chapter 3 to where tribute was being paid. In verse 4, let's see, 2 Kings 3. Verse 4 says, and I guess Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheepmaster, rendered unto the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with wool. So basically Moab was paying tribute to Israel for safety, protection. And then, we won't read this whole chapter, but in 2 Kings chapter 3, the king of Moab decides he's not going to do that anymore. And what happened is Israel came and attacked Moab. So Moab chose not to do that, chose that he didn't want Israel's protection, he didn't need it, and that caused Israel to then attack them. So we do have recorded history in the Bible of Moab sending tribute to Judah, Jerusalem, for protection. And it goes on to say, to the ruler of the land from Selah to the wilderness unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. So let's see here. A little laser pointer. Okay. So here we have Moab, and this is where it's good to study your maps. I guess that's geography. Study your maps, know where things are. So we have the Dead Sea here. We have Moab, and we have Judah. And Moab, so this offering says, send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah to the wilderness. Well, down below Moab is Edom, which is not shown on the map. But Edom is down here. Selah is in Edom. Selam is also another reference for Petra, which is the capital of Edom. So it says, send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah. Okay, so we're given some directions. So they're coming down through here. into Selah or Petra, into the wilderness. So we have the folks that are going to be the spokesman or whatever taking this tribute to Jerusalem. They're coming down below the Dead Sea, and they're going to make their way up to, it says, unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. So does anyone want to guess what that would be referencing, the mount of the daughter of Zion? So, yeah, so we're in Judah, and we know Jerusalem is here at the northern part of Judah. So I'm just bringing this up so that we can have better ideas of where these places are located. So Moab is sending their tribute. They're traveling down through Petra or Selah, through the wilderness, and they're making their way up to Jerusalem to give the tribute. And it says, "For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon." So again, we're dealing with places and things here on the map. So does anyone know what the reference of the fords of Arnon would be? Does anyone know where Arnon is?
The border of Moab and Amorites.
That's right. So you can't tell on this map, but right here through this section is the river of Arnon. And the river of Arnon was a main water source that they could go to and get fresh water. So this was a very popular place for the Moabites who have went to, the fords of Arnon. So I bring this up just so that we can make some sense of what Selah is, what this wilderness is, what this daughter of Zion is. Why is the fords of Arnon so important to these people? Well, back then when they would be hearing this and they heard fords of Arnon, I mean, that would just be like instant. Oh yeah, I mean, fords of Arnon, the river of Arnon is where we get our main water source. So in the first two verses, that's what we're talking about. Moab is sending their tribute, just like we read in 2 Kings chapter 3. And they're sending their tribute up to Jerusalem, and they're doing this for protection. They were paying tribute for protection. So this brings us into maybe some more complicated parts of the verses here. So now it goes and it says, "Take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth. Let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end, the spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land." So this is where it gets a little complicated when we're reading here. And we have to continue to realize we're still on the same subject matter as what we started in chapter 15. We're still talking about Moab. We're still talking about the judgment. And it's continued here in the chapter 16. So the question would be, skipping down into verse 4, so who do you guys think the extortioner and the oppressor would be in this time period? Think about who everybody is fearing at this time. Who's trying to be the new ruler of the world? They're trying to take over the world. That's right. So we still have Assyria in the background here, and this is what everybody's afraid of, and they're terrified of Assyria coming down. And history records that Assyria is indeed going to come down, and they are going to destroy Moab. And the reason it is, God allowed them to do it. Now, Assyria had no idea that they were going to fulfill something that God was going to allow to do anyway. They were just doing it to conquer everybody they could and destroy whoever got in their way. So yeah, we have Assyria in the background that everybody's afraid of, including Judah. They're afraid of them too, because Assyria is making their way south. So, here we have, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them for the face of the spoiler. So, this is where it got a little confusing for me. So we're talking about Moab, and we're talking about them sending their tribute, and then all of a sudden we're talking about, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. And I started looking at all kinds of different translations of the Bible to see if it was worded differently in any of these other translations. And I did find one that, I want to be cautious when we get into these different translations. But I did find one, and it was the New American Standard Version. And I'm not sure when this version even came out, but obviously it's a newer of the many versions out there. So in the King James Version, it says, let mine counsel, take counsel, execute judgment, make my shadow as a night in the midst of the noonday, hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth, let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab, be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler. So, in the King James Version, it's almost like, Moab, we can offer you some protection for your people to come and hide in our land, but then again, on the other hand, if we need to go hide in your land, we should be allowed to do it. And that's kind of how I was taking the King James Version for reading. And then in the New American Standard Version, they broke it down as to saying, in quotations, as if Moab was saying these things, saying, give us advice, make a decision, cast your shadow like night at high noon, hide the outcast, do not betray the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab stay with you. Be a hiding place for them from the destroyer. So, the New American Standard Version just makes it as if this is Moab asking for Judah to allow their outcasts to come and stay in their land as a hiding place. So, there is some references. I have some Bible references or note from the people who wrote this particular Bible, or translated this particular Bible. They tried to make a reference to Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And I read those two chapters, and I still couldn't understand, where this is talking about Israel fleeing into Moab. And in my mind, it made more sense that Moab is still asking to have that protection from Israel. And the reason I say that is because starting in verse 6 of this same chapter, it talks about how they basically chose to continue that prideful life. And if we're talking about Moab being judged, it just seems to flow in the context that Moab's the one asking for the protection. But I would like to ask y'all's opinion on this.
There's Assyria. Are they coming from north now?
They're coming from north, yeah.
And Moab is below where they're coming to, so wouldn't people flee from there into Moab to get away from Assyria?
We'll see, and that's where, maybe let's turn to Ezekiel. maybe if we all read it, we can shed some light here. So if we go to the book of Ezekiel, and that's right, and I was thinking that too. This could go both ways. Judah's offering protection, but if Judah needs to have a hiding place, then they would be allowed to go flee into Moab and hide. So yeah, I see where you're going. And if as a group here we can make a connection with Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Does anyone have a map that would show the land of Magog? Where's the land of Magog? Does anyone know? And I don't know if I have internet connection to look it up. I'm going to try though.
So is Ezekiel, I know he's a priest, is he during this time frame?
He would be connected with some of the same prophecies. Same thing with Jeremiah. So what we're trying to figure out, oh, I do have internet connection. Oh, it's not up there though. Probably a good thing.
So, who are an outcast? Is that what we're trying to do?
Yeah, that's right. And I do not have internet connection. It cut me off. But that is right. I was just wanting to see before we even started reading this chapter 38. I wanted to see location-wise where we're at with what we're talking about. But you're right, Shannon. I want to find out.
Because if you're saying, so,
You're trying to think, this is Isaiah talking,
My PowerPoint froze up. Hold on a minute. Okay, maybe if I turn this off. There we go. Yeah, so
I'm on that, but it's really just it.
really?
Sheriff, so the land of Gog and Magog, is that what you're?
Yeah. Is Moab a part of that area? It would be right next to the Dead Sea. But yeah, Shannon, like you said, the thing is to try to figure out who the outcasts are that's being talked about here. Let mine outcasts dwell with thee, Moab. So according to the New American Standard Version, the outcasts would be those who are the Moabites. But according to the King James Version and the New King James Version and the regular American Standard Version, it reads it like this, which gives you the indication that, the outcasts could be some outcasts out of Judah fleeing from Assyria, and that they would repay the favor of that same protection. If they're paying tribute to Jerusalem for protection, then they would be expected to repay the favor of allowing their land as a hiding place also. And like Penny just said, geographically speaking, Assyria is making their way south. They're going to end up hitting Judah before they get down to Moab. And it would make sense for Moab to be that hiding place that would be allowed for God's people to flee and hide. But do you see what I'm saying, though? When you read these verses, it can get a little complicated in trying to understand what we're talking about. So before we get too bogged down into this minute detail, let's look at the overall picture here. So the overall picture is God's people have a shield and protection from God because they're living right. God's going to protect them. So the overall picture down in verse 5, it says, "And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging, seeking judgment, and hasting righteousness." So the ultimate picture is those who obey God and continue to obey God, they're going to be able to partake in the ultimate promise that God has for his people. And that's going to be protection and love from God. That's going to be righteousness, justice. Ultimately, in the future, that's going to be Jesus Christ coming to this earth and establishing his kingdom. And that, that's a promise for God's people, is that the Messiah was going to come and he was going to be a part of the lineage. So when we're looking at this, and in my mind, I make a connection. I'm trying not to get too overburdened here with the minute details, but I made the connection of looking back into chapter 15 in verse 5 where it said, "My heart shall cry out for Moab." God's desires for all mankind to live faithfully unto him. And we're sitting here and we're talking about this mercy, the justice, and the righteousness that can be found within following God. And then in the very next verse, we see that they chose not to. So the ultimate end result is, if you're following God and you're doing what he wants you to do, you're going to have protection. But if you refuse God, you're not going to have the protection, and you're going to be outcasted like Moab was outcasted, and they were destroyed. So let's see here. Before I move on, and I know I'm rambling a bit here, what kind of comments do you guys have so far about us looking at these verses? I want to hear your take on who you think the outcasts are and what these verses are really talking about. You got something? Huh? Well, let's share it.
I feel like this is Isaiah prophesying for God.
Mm-hmm.
So when Paul was saying nine outcasts, that's kind of what I focused in on also. So who would be God's outcasts if this is Isaiah speaking for God? So to be his people, fleeing from Assyria, trying to get away, they would go away from where they're coming from. So they would flee to Moab. And if Moab, like you had said, had done what they were supposed to do and obeyed, and like they had sent tribute, they were friendly with them at one point, but then we read it last week.
Yeah,
After Ahab died, they were.
that's right. That's right.
And they decided not to do that, and they didn't even proceed, because they weren't supposed to. Because they didn't.
And that's my take. They're paying tribute for protection. As long as everything was in good standings and Moab was willing to share that same protection if the people of Judah needed it, you know, everything was going good. But like you just said in 2 Kings, we saw that Moab decided they don't need that protection anymore and they're not going to pay that tribute. And we're going to see that also here in verse 6, that of what they chose to do. And like I said, I keep trying to make this connection back in chapter 15, verse 5 of God's heart cried out for Moab. And I want us to always keep in mind that everyone on this earth has a fair chance to be found obedient in the sight of God. We get too wrapped up into these heathen nations, which is what they're labeled as, and we sometimes lose sight of the fact that these heathen nations had every opportunity to be in good standings with God, but they chose not to.
Don't they have some kind of connection with Christ's lineage? Moab?
The Moabites, Ruth, that's right.
God's got to keep them. To keep Christ's lineage with some, I don't know. They're connected to it. Some part of it, maybe. That's why he keeps giving them a chance. I guess.
And they flip-flop through history. They'll be allies, then they'll be rebelling against them, then they're allies and they're rebelling against them again.
It's kind of weird.
And they're flip-flopping.
Kind of,
So I'm going to bring up another bit of a monkey wrench here. So there's a debate on verse 5. And I was talking to Penny the other night, and I really liked where her mind went with this. And she may not even remember, but in verse 5, so when you guys read verse 5, wow, I didn't realize the time is really flying here, and we haven't made it through hardly anything. Anyway, it's part of the study. In verse 5 it says, "And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness." So there's a huge debate amongst people as to what this is talking to. A lot of people are saying that verses 1 through 4, we're talking about Moab and the things that are happening right then and there, and then they're saying in verse 5, suddenly we jump ahead into the future, and now it's suddenly talking about the everlasting kingdom that Christ came to establish. What's your thoughts on that?
I've got a crossroads for chapter 9, 6, and 7, which is talking about Christ. But that's got a star on the side of it. Chapter 5 didn't have no star.
Okay.
My thought every time there's a prophecy about Jesus is a white star on the side.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 5 didn't have it.
That's right.
Crossroads for chapter 32:1 and 55:40. I don't think it's talking about the Christ, but
Well, Penny, would you, Hezekiah,
Oh, the king.
yeah, would you mind sharing that with the class?
You remember there.
No.
So, we were talking about last week that they tribute because Ahab was the king. He was not the king, and then that would be inside the war. that's why his son Hezekiah came. And he did that which was right inside the Lord, which I think is why maybe there was a little bit of a reprieve from Syria coming.
So,
Which with Moses, they had a faithful king. He sat upon the thrones.
and see, I think that would be most likely what we're talking about here, to keep it within the context of the two chapters. Instead of jumping way in the future, talking about the kingdom of Christ, keeping it in the context of what's happening. Like Penny said, Hezekiah was going to be the good king, bringing justice and, trying to bring righteousness and keep people, guiding them as being followers of God and what God expects, unlike his dad. So yeah, I'm on board with that avenue being taken. And you may ask, well, what about the avenue if you took that it's talking about the church? Well, like I said earlier, ultimately, the outcome's going to be the same. You're either following God or you're not following God. So if the outcome is, this is talking about Hezekiah leading the people back to living faithful lives, okay, so be it. Good. If it's talking about the kingdom coming, then okay, so be it. Good. I mean, the kingdom, really, when you're talking about judging, and if you look that word up, it's more like justice or seeking judgment, hasting righteousness. I mean, is that not descriptions of the kingdom anyway? Having God, being in the righteousness of God. So the overall outcome, whether you keep it in this time period or you jump ahead many, many, many years into their future, the ultimate outcome is we're staying in good standings with God. You're going to have his protection. He's going to be your shield. You're going to be blessed. You're going to be in his righteousness, his justice, and you get there either way. We really didn't get very far here. I guess we can continue on just a little bit. We got some time. I know this seems a little butchered, but honestly, I had some difficulty with it, and I was wanting to see your guys' take, and it sounds like we're all on the same page of keeping it in the context. So let's see here. All right. So verses 6 through 12 says, we have heard of the pride of Moab. So here's where it transitions. We have heard of the pride of Moab. He is very proud, even of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath, but his lies shall not be so. Therefore shall Moab howl for Moab. Everyone shall howl for the foundations of Keraruseth. Shall ye mourn? Surely they are stricken. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the heathen have broken down the principal plants thereof. They are come even to Jazer. They wandered through the wilderness. Her branches are stretched out. They are gone over the sea. Therefore I will bewail with weeping of Jazer, the vine of Sibmah. I will water thee with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh. For the shouting of the summer fruits and for the harvest is fallen. And gladness is taken. I'm not sure why I have a 0 there. Anyway, gladness is taken away, and joy out of the plentiful field and the vineyards, and there shall be no singing, neither shall there be shouting. The treaders shall tread out no wine in their presses. I have made their vintage shouting to cease. Wherefore my bowels shall sound like a harp for Moab, mine inward parts for Kerish, and it shall come to pass when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high place, that shall come to his sanctuary to pray, but he shall not prevail. So, as we can see, we have a bit of a difference here in the description of verse 6 compared to verse 5. So in verse 5 we read, let me get there. Verse 5 we had judging and judgment and righteousness being discussed. And then here in verse 6 we have pride and wrath and lies being discussed. So instead of choosing the righteous path that they were trying to be convinced to follow, here in verse 6 we see that they indeed actually chose the path of basically wanting to do what they wanted to do, and that's a path of arrogance and pride, a path of their own idols, a path of their own boastfulness, and that's where they got off page. That's where they fell off the path of righteousness, is they chose to do this. So they weren't going to have God's protection. And matter of fact, if you go back to chapter 2, throughout our whole study here in Isaiah, we've read about these instances of people choosing to go back to that prideful life. And let's see here in Isaiah chapter 2, starting in verse 11, if somebody wants to read verses 11 through 22, we can see another instance that we've already covered.
Yeah, I'll read.
Okay?
The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. The day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone that is proud and lofty, and upon everyone that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. And upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all those of Bashan, and upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, and upon every high tower, and upon every fenced wall, and upon all the ships of Tarshish, upon all pleasant pictures, and upon all pleasant pictures. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low. And the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And the idols he shall utterly abolish. And they shall go into the holes of the rocks, and into the caves of the earth, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to go shake terribly the earth. And that day a man shall cast his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each one for himself to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks. Fear the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of.
All right. So one thing we can learn from what Mark just read is you got all these powerful nations who say that, they're the ultimate power, they're superior. And one thing we're learning is all that power can just be stripped away in an instant. Moab thought they were powerful and superior. It's going to be stripped away. Assyria thinks that they're powerful and superior. All that's going to be stripped away. Babylon thought that they were powerful and superior to everything. And guess what? It was all stripped away. And it just continues through history. Man ultimately does not have the upper hand on anything. God is the one who has the upper hand. And when you look at these verses here in chapter 16, that verses 6 through 12, it can be split up into three different sections here. Let's see. In verse 7, it says, "Therefore shall Moab," talking about the consequences of what's going to happen for their actions. Verses 7 and 8, And then we have in verse 9, we have another, therefore, I will be well with the weeping of Jazer, more consequences for their actions. And then we also have in verse 11, we have, wherefore my bowels shall sound like a harp for Moab, mine inward parts for Curush. So basically we're seeing God's reactions towards their sinful behavior here. And then we're going to make our way down here into verses 13 and 14. It says, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning Moab since that time. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of an hireling, and the glory of Moab shall the contemned with all the great multitude, and the remnant shall be very small and feeble. So, as a connection here, we can actually look at the book of Zephaniah, because basically this is telling us this destruction is coming quickly. It's coming quickly and assuredly. So if somebody wanted to turn real quick to Zephaniah and read chapter 2, verse 9, we can see how Zephaniah is speaking of a complete destruction that's going to come upon Moab, just like God's declaring here, and just like Isaiah is prophesying. Okay?
Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah, even the breeding of nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The residue of my people shall spoil them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them.
All right. So there's going to be an assurity of their destruction for their sinful behaviors and their outright neglect and refusal to just simply live like God wants them to live. And I wish we had a little bit more time to make some quick application here. I can make a very quick application, and I'll shorten this up for you guys. So we're talking about Isaiah 15, verse 5, my heart shall cry out for Moab. We're talking about these chances that they had, just like Clark brought up, and that they keep refusing that. And it's almost like you have to look at Moab, and it's like the blessings that could have been for Moab, you know. They could have partaken of all these blessings, and they chose not to. Let me shorten this up. So talking about, you know, the blessings of righteousness. So in verse 5, we have, you know what, I don't want to rush this. So why don't we just put a pin in this? I don't want to rush it. Next week, I do want to present some application here that we can use for us today. And it's just no sense in going through it really quick if we don't have to. So we'll put a pin in it. I'll pick up in this, and then we'll pick up in chapter 17 next week. And we'll say that's the end of class.